John chapter 2, and we're gonna look at really verses 12 through 22. Okay. Last week we began looking at the revelations or the unveilings of the nature of Jesus Christ, God the Son, and we saw that we saw his creative power when he transformed the water into wine. That was a creative aspect of his power. Now, in the Hebrew, there are a couple of words that they use, in Hebrew and in the Greek, there are a couple of different words that they use for different aspects of creating, okay? One of them is bara, B-A-R-A, and that's creating out of something that's already there, or transforming, okay? You and I, in one sense of the word, when we go from being unsaved to saved, that's kind of a bara, kind of. But one of the best examples of it is what we looked at last week. He had water, and he bara, or he created wine out of it. That's not how he created the entire universe. That's how he created human beings, though. If you remember, he got from the dust of the ground, and then he created Adam. But the way he created the universe was another word, ex nihilo. It means out of nothing. So last week, we kind of looked at both of them, but we really focused on the bara, his creative power out of something else. This week, we're going to get a glimpse at a revelation or a picture of Christ and his supremacy over God's house. We're going to look at a number of different aspects. We're going to look at something that we probably all deal with to one degree or another, and that is anger. Do any of you not deal with anger at all? We all do to some degree or another. Some people very, very, they got a pretty good handle on it. There are people that are just kind of naturally laid back. And then there are people that are, for lack of a better term, psychopaths and everything in between. Okay? So we're going to kind of look at anger. Is it okay? How do we deal with it? Because we're going to get a picture of it here. This is one of those times where Jesus models something that we're supposed to picture in our own lives. And we're going to start this section off with asking a question. Is anger, look at the question now, always wrong? How many think anger is always wrong? Raise your hand if you think anger is always wrong. I kind of gave the answer in there. Whenever you see always or never, usually it's not true, okay? But in this case, you're absolutely right. It's not always wrong, depending on what kind of anger it is. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. There are times when we should get angry. As a matter of fact, I think that there are people in this world, and there's stuff going on in this world, because there's no anger, you almost got to check their pulse and say, hey, is there anything going on there? Because some of the stuff is horrific that's going on in the world. But Ephesians 4 kind of gives us a clue. It says, be ye angry. God would never tell you to do something that was sin. So right there, we know at least some kind of anger is right. Be ye angry and sin not. See, that's kind of the qualifying point there. Let not the sun go down on your wrath. There's another aspect there. Neither give place to the devil. I used to work at a construction plant, and we had this huge batch plant where we would mix the concrete. And the concrete used to have very specific parameters. There was a specific amount of water, gravel, cement, and about anywhere from a half dozen to a dozen chemicals. One of the chemicals was simply called super. That's all we called it. I'm sure there was a technical name for it, but we all called it super. The reason why we called it super was if you put a little, it had to be a specific amount. Now, the batch plant would mix 12 yards, which equaled out to 24 tons of concrete. Okay? We're talking a lot of concrete. Very specific amount of super had to go in there. When the super went in there, it would heat up the concrete, and it would make it cure faster and harder. We would be able to pour concrete in the morning, a bridge or a barrier or a culvert or something like that. We even poured prison cells. We could pull them in the afternoon and set them standing up, and they would be fine. They'd be strong enough. They would actually hit a 5,000 psi, or pounds per square inch, strength in 7 hours because of the chemical. If you didn't put enough chemical in, If you tried to take it out, it would break apart. If you put too much chemical in, boom, it would get really, really hot. And if it got on your skin, it would literally burn right into your skin. So there was a lot of safety. And we had what was called, in order to keep it just right, we had a bunch of regulators that kept it from getting too hot. Getting too hot was a bad thing. It would ruin the piece, but it would be very dangerous for all the people. There are a couple of regulators to kind of keep the heat of anger where it's supposed to be. The first one is don't sin and be controlled by your anger, according to this, okay? Don't sin and be controlled by your anger. Who in the Bible can you remember was controlled by their anger right from the very beginning? Cain, okay, Cain. And we know that in Genesis chapter 4, 6 and 7, God warns him. He says, why is your face fallen? Why is your countenance down? Why are you angry? He said, and then God warned him. He said, be careful. Sin crouches at the door. It's kind of pictured like a wild animal ready to pounce and devour him. So anger is pictured as this wild animal. So our first thing is, it says, be angry and sin not. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath. In other words, don't let something else control it. You control it. Don't let it control you. Okay? The second regulator is don't give Satan an opportunity to produce his character in you. Now, the first one's pretty scary. We all know people that get mad and they hold grudges. I got family members that haven't talked to other family members for 30 years because they had an argument. Nobody remembers why they're fighting, but they're still so angry at each other. That's being controlled by your anger. Lashing out with violence or physicality, being controlled by your anger, okay? But this one, I think, is pretty scary. Don't give Satan an opportunity to reproduce his character in you. Somebody that's going to come on the scene, I believe relatively soon, may very well even be on the scene, that's going to be a good picture of this is the Antichrist. He's going to be filled with the spirit of the devil and his anger. We read in Revelation 12:12 that the devil's cast out of heaven and he's on the earth. And it says, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. The devil has come down with great wrath. And it's this picture of the seething, vicious, violent red dragon ready to destroy. He's also called, the devil is also called a roaring lion who's seeking to devour us. So you got two, anger left to itself, we have two poster children that we follow, Cain and the devil. We don't want to be like either one of them. The regulators will help us to control that. And we're going to kind of look at this a little bit more as we get in here, but we should get angry at things. We should get angry at injustice and oppression of people, the slaughter of children, babies, unborn babies. We should be angry at this stuff. When God is defamed or blasphemed, we should be angry at these things. God uses our anger as a catalyst to correct that which is wrong, and that's a right and proper thing. In this story, we find God himself getting angry, and he corrects something that is very wrong. So let's jump in and take a look here. John chapter 2, beginning of verse 12, says, after this, he, Christ, went down to Capernaum. He and his mother and his brethren and his disciples. So at this point in time, even his family is on board. His mom, his brothers, and his dad, they're all on board. Okay, they just saw him do a miracle. They're like, oh, let's go see what else he's going to do. And they continued not many days, and the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So I got a little map here. It's kind of hard to see, but you can look at your map on the back there if you like. Here's Nazareth, where he starts out. He goes to Cana. That's where the last week we talked about with the turning the water into wine. Okay, and then he travels from Cana to Capernaum, and then he goes from Capernaum all the way down here to Jerusalem. So he's up here in the north. He goes all the way down to, where did I go? Jerusalem, right there. And remember, Nazareth was kind of his hometown, but he was rejected there. So he kind of changes his base of operation, moves his base of operation to Capernaum. It's the place where Matthew was called, okay? And it was located on a major trade route. It was a very important city. There was a Roman garrison there. But from Cana to Capernaum is about 16 miles. From Capernaum down to Jerusalem is about 85 miles. So why is he going down there according to the verse? Why is he going down to Jerusalem? The Passover. He's going to celebrate the Passover. Okay? So what do we know about the Passover? You guys tell me. Share with me something that you know about the Passover. That's right. That's why it's called the Passover. It was during it was before the Exodus, not during it. It was before the Exodus, and it was the last plague. And the Hebrews, or if they put the blood of a lamb on the lintel and on the doorposts, right? The angel of death would come over. He'd see the blood, and he'd pass over that home. Any home that did not have the blood on it, the death angel would go in and take the life of the firstborn child, and then go on to the next house. We know that in Hebrews, it says, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. Was it a big deal? Was the Passover a big deal? Yes. The event was a big deal. Was celebrating it a big deal as well? Absolutely. It's a huge deal. This is when it was on the 15th month of Nisan, which is about mid-April. Every Jewish male from 12 years old and older, they were supposed to attend 3 annual feasts in Jerusalem. Let's see what you know about your feasts. Does anybody remember what they are? The first one, you got it already. What's the first one? Passover. Jen's covered. You guys should have jumped on that one. Okay? What are the other 2? Anybody remember? Another one begins with a P. Yeah, the tabernacles. Tabernacles, Purim, okay? And Pentecost, okay? It was required of them to go through these. Now, as the Jews scattered around the world, it was kind of tough for them to get there, but anybody within 15 miles, now think about how far away it is. Anybody within 15 miles, any man, age 12 or older, within 15 miles, it was required. It was required. Okay? Jesus traveled 85 miles to make sure he came to this celebration, this feast, this Passover. Okay? During Passover, there would be anywhere from 2 to 2.75 million Jews celebrating in the city itself. It was a big deal. No problem so far, right? Here's where the problem comes in. Okay, in verse 14, it says, when Jesus traveled down there, and he found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and changes of money sitting. Okay, so in the temple, there was oxen, sheep, doves. They were being sold. Money changers were conducting business. And this was taking place in the outer court known as the court of the Gentiles. And I believe this is a rendition of what the temple probably looked like during this time period. It's an artist's rendition, okay? So this is what was going on. The market started as a convenience for the Jews who had traveled long distances. Now, you're traveling 85 miles down from Capernaum. With animals, it's going to be a tough trip. Many of the animals probably are not going to make it. Remember, this is not nice roads, and Rome had started putting roads in there, and some of them were okay, but they weren't, and there was robbers and all kinds of stuff going on. So they would travel down there, and then they would be able to buy the animals for the sacrifices. It was supposed to be outside of the temple, not anywhere in the temple. It was required that it was outside the temple. To give you an idea of how big this space was, by the way, the court of the Gentiles was 14 acres, just the court of the Gentiles alone. This is not Woodland Valley Church. This is this huge expanse of place. It was massive. Okay, and they were kind of selling. They were supposed to be conducting business outside on the street, but Jesus comes down and he sees them conducting business in an area that they were not supposed to. But not just conducting business, conducting very, very shady, profiteering business, which doesn't go well with God. We like to, the world likes to think, the world has all kinds of pictures of God. But a lot of people want to think of God as not God of the Bible, but a higher power who's just gentle and nice and just accepts everything. And he is a God of love. Okay, let's make no mistake about that. But he is also a God of justice. The fact that he's a God of justice lends more weight to the fact that he's also a God of love, and vice versa. Okay? So, he's not happy here. The priests allowed this to happen because they got a share of the profits. And we're going over this part to let you know exactly what made Christ so angry. He didn't just wake up and, stub his toe and then start tipping over tables and kicking people out of the temple. He was angry for a reason. Okay? So this is what would happen. People would buy people would buy stuff on the street, an animal on the street. They'd bring it into the temple. They had to be unblemished. But there would be examiners in the temple, and they would charge you to examine the animal. And they would charge you typically 2 dinars, which would be 2 hours of work. So, Troy, you'd buy an animal on the street because you're thinking, it's too expensive in a temple. Okay, I'm going to go to Costco instead. So you go to Costco on the street, you get your lamb, you bring it in. You already paid a pretty good amount for the lamb. You bring it in, but David has to check it out. Right. And he says, hey, I'm the inspector. You got to give me 2 dinars, which is 2 hours of wages. Like, okay. And then he would say, nope, not good enough. You got to buy another one. Many times. Okay. Now let me give you an idea of the cost of this. Okay. Just for many of people who didn't have money to get a lamb, they could buy doves instead. Okay. And a dove or 2 doves outside of the temple would cost 8 dinars, or about a full day's wage. That's outside of the temple. You'd bring it in the temple. David would say, not good enough. Now, Troy, you got to come to me, because I'm selling stuff right here in the temple, and they've already been checked. But I would charge you 150 dinars, which would be 19 days' wage. You couldn't leave the temple to go back out and get another one, and you wouldn't want to. You say, how many times are you going to do this? I have a deal with Dave to say, hey, every 3rd person say, not good enough, so that way we can make some money. And everybody was fleecing everybody. It was a racket going right in the temple. And God was furious about this. The money changers themselves were cashing in on this too, because Joe, you'd bring some money in to buy this. We're going to go back to Troy. Troy, now you're going to buy the something off of me. But you couldn't just bring your money. You needed to have special money, because the Jews' silver was more pure than foreign money. And if you came from a foreign land and you had a foreign king stamped like Caesar, it wouldn't be allowed in the temple, so you couldn't use that. But you could go over to the money changer, which is Nathan. And Nathan would do a markup, and he'd fleece you for some money. So by the time you're done, you're looking at about a month's wages just for 2 turtle doves to sacrifice in the temple. I mean, no wonder he was furious. Everybody, he's getting a cut, I'm getting a cut, he's getting a cut, and the priests are getting a cut, and the Pharisees, and God, and he's looking, he comes walking into the court of the Gentiles. He sees this going on. Obviously, he knew what was going on. He's God. But he gets fired up, and it's a proper anger. Okay, so let's go to our next part here, and we're going to see what he's going to do about it. It says in John chapter 2, verse 15, and when he had made a scourge of small cords, a scourge is kind of like not really a whip, but kind of like a little whip, okay? He drove them out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the money changers' money, and overthrew the tables. He's not playing games. You know, you see a lot of artistic rendition of who Christ was, and they show this guy with soft features, dove blue eyes, just smiling, very almost effeminate, and he's just kind of passive. That's not what's going on here, okay? He is ticked off, okay? He makes the scourge. He drives people out of the temple. Now, you got to see, now, at this point, those of us that get angry easy, we're like, oh, yeah, give it to him, Jesus. This is good. This is, yeah. Before we get too far down, because I'm 3/4 Cherokee Indian. I got fire in my blood, and it's not good. I got to keep it down. So when I look at this, when I first read this, I'm like, yeah, baby, I can be me. Wait a minute. I looked into it a little bit more. Let's take a look here. The words drove out it's a Greek term that means by authority and strength of his presence, not by force or violence. So Christ comes in, he's got this scourge. It doesn't say that he whipped people and whipped animals and whipped this and whipped that. He made a scourge, and he comes in, and the force of his presence, the strength of his presence, people didn't want to mess with him. Okay? Like we said, it's the first of 2 cleansings in the temple. John records here the cleansing at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. The other Gospels record it at the end. There's 2 different cleansings here. Okay? But here's the question, and we've kind of answered it. Why does Jesus do this? The first reason is God's house was being desecrated. Exactly. God is being Jesus never once defended himself in his entire ministry. Okay, you want to talk about having a control over anger? The world is unfair. You'll hear that from people all the time. Everything's unfair. You're unfair. This person's unfair. The government's unfair. School's unfair. My job's unfair. The church is unfair. Unfair. Yeah. The answer to that is yeah. Everything's unfair. But who is more treated unfairly than Christ? Yet never once did he defend himself. He defended the Father, the Father's house, and the church. God the Son comes. He sees his Father's house being desecrated, and he is irate. You have worship without reverence taking place, dispute over coins, the stench and racket of animals. I mean, think about this. They're in the temple. What are these animals doing in the temple? They're desecrating it physically as well. And you get the stench of that. And he's like, are you kidding me? My family, I like animals, but we're not house animal people. Angela doesn't like animals in our house. We don't have any puppies or anything like that. I know a lot of people doing it. She doesn't, because she doesn't like the smell. She doesn't like the animals in the house. She's like, hey, you want to have a dog? Have them outside. That's fine. So that's why we don't have a dog. But this is way beyond that, because God's temple, God's house is supposed to be perfectly pure and holy. And Christ walks in, and he's assaulted by the stench, the noise, the chaos, all the irreverence, and it's not conducive to worship. And he removes it. So that's the first one. What's another reason, possible reason? Think about, go ahead. Fulfillment of prophecy, absolutely. Okay, we definitely have a fulfillment of prophecy. Rick, I actually didn't write that one down there because I put it in Matthew, but from Malachi. But you're absolutely right. It is a fulfillment of prophecy. Okay, which is a big deal because it strengthens our assurance of Christ. What's another reason? Think of where it's being done. Does anybody know what the court of the Gentiles was for? We see the different courts. We know what the basin was for. We know we did a study on this a couple years ago. But does anybody know what the court of the Gentiles was for? Obviously, it was for the Gentiles. But what was it meant to do? Anybody know? What were the Jews called to do? What made the Jews God's chosen people? They're chosen to do what? Get God's message to the rest of the world. The call of the Gentiles was for that purpose. It was for Gentiles or non-Jews to come in and be able to seek and to worship God. We see it here. We see in Mark chapter 11, verse 17. And he taught saying unto them, is it not written, my house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer? This would have been scandalous in that culture. The Jews would have been like, what are you talking about? We're God's chosen people. And God's trying to say, yeah, I chose you to do something. I chose you for a reason. We're going to talk about this a little bit on Sunday, actually. Okay? With all the racket and the commotion and the trading, the Gentiles seeking the Lord would have been shut out of this. And he was irate about that. And there was one final one. They were not worshiping from the heart, obviously. You can have all the sacrifices you want, but if your heart is not where it's supposed to be, God doesn't want anything to do with it. We see that in Isaiah chapter 1. We see it in Jeremiah chapter 7. But look at this in Psalm 51. It says, for thou desirest not sacrifice. This is the psalmist writing about God. You don't want sacrifice, else I would give it. Thou delightest not in burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are what? A broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. God wants your heart. Worship without heart is empty and worthless to God. We could set up an altar in here and have all kinds of sacrifices going on, and God's what? That doesn't do anything for me. You can sing. You can have the voice of an angel and sing praises to God, but if your heart is not in it, it's ugly sounding to the Lord. Yes, Rick. That's right. It was a picture, and that's a great point. The whole sacrificial system was a picture of what? God himself being sacrificed, sacrificing himself. And to desecrate that picture, that puts a whole new disgust level to it. So no wonder he's angry. God wants our hearts. And right from the very beginning, it was being desecrated. Look at Matthew chapter 15, verse 8. This people draw nigh unto me with their mouth. They're praising and they're singing and they're doing all kinds of stuff. And honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. What a sad commentary on human worship.